Evo, dobrodošli svi na prvi dan Zagreb Book Festivala. I naša večerašnja inozemna gošća je Rachida Lamrabet iz Belgije, marokansko-belgijska autorica. Ovom prilikom predstavit ćemo vaš posljednji roman, Reci, nekome. U Hrvatskoj ga je objavila izdavačka kuća Ljevak, u prijevodu Romane Perečinec. I moram napomenuti da je Rachida ovdje kao gošća u okviru projekta Every Story Matters, znači svaka priča je važna. Projekt se bavi pitanjima migracija, identiteta, drugosti i inkluzivnosti, što je vrlo srodno i temama kojima se vi, Rachida, bavite. Prije nego što kažemo nešto o romanu, rado bih da se ukratko dotaknemo i vaše životne priče i momenata iz vaše biografije. I za vas su dva romana, Zemlja žena i Čovjek koji nije bio htio biti pokopan, te zbirka priča Božje dijete. Dijete ste marokanskih doseljenika u Belgiju, rođena u Maroku i kao djevojčica doselila u Belgiju, odvjetnica po svojoj glavnoj profesiji. I koji je bio vaš put u književnost?
Thank you for the welcoming. Good evening, everyone. Very glad to be back in Zagreb. I was here a few years ago for the European Short Story Festival, and so happy to be back here. Yeah, well, the question about my trajectory as a writer is quite common, I think. I was a kid who had a vivid imagination and who loved really to read and to hear stories. I was the oldest. I am the oldest of a big family, and I loved to entertain my brothers and sisters by telling them stories, writing stories myself at a certain point. And I read a lot, of course, and I read at a certain age also very much the books that could help me to to learn more about my surroundings, myself, and what I discovered also was that the literature that we had, for instance, at school, was a literature that where I could not really identify with, or let's say it this way, that I could not really recognize my own immediate world in it. So I began at a very early age to look for that kind of stories where I could recognize myself in. And at a very early age I discovered, for instance, some Moroccan French writers, like Tahar Ben Jelloun, for instance, which became for me a kind of a role model, because he managed to create a literary world where I could identify with, I could recognize some of the elements that he was talking about. So that was, at an early age, something that I really searched for and found very important to discover. And I think that was also a bit the motivation for me to be very sensitive in what I read, to look from what kind of perspective is this story told, what voices do we hear and what voices do we not hear. And it was for me important to read books that opened up my world and talked about situations from different perspectives. I think that is what I'm also trying to do with my literature, that I try to tell stories from a different perspective, give voice to characters that are mainly not heard of or not, they do not have a forum to talk, to tell their story. So that's, I think, a very important motivation for me to write.
Hvala. Evo, kako je možda vaše porijeklo, znači utjecalo da se bavite temama identiteta? Konkretno recimo u romanu Reci to nekome imamo taj odnos oca i sina, dakle dvije pripovedne linije. Na početku jedan slikar, Francuz, priča svoje iskustvo boravka u marokanskom selu i gradovima na prijelazu 20. stoljeća, kada je u jednom selu obljubio veoma mladu djevojku i nakon odlaska nije znao da je djevojka zatrudnjela i rodila kćer. Gotovo 2 desetljeća nakon toga sin ga slučajno prolazi na ulicama grada Paza, da? I u njegovoj mapi otkriva sliku njegove majke. Kada shvati da je zapravo upoznao oca, shvati da se sreo sa francuskim dijelom tog identiteta, svog vlastitog identiteta. Kako ste došli do te priče, kako je ona nastala kao fikcija i kako ste je spojili sa nekakvim povijesnim kontekstom u kojem je nastala?
So, yeah, this story is, of course, had a quite difficult, how to say it was not that easy to assemble this story, because I had different voices in my head that I wanted really to give a place in the story. But what mainly drove me to write this book is the fact that I wanted to tell a story about our collective memory and history, about what do we recollect from history, what do we forget about history, and when we forget things about our history, do we do that on purpose or is it by accident? Why do we forget some things, and why do we give emphasis on other things? So, and the specific time frame that I wanted to talk about was the First World War, because at a certain moment we had this commemoration of the Great War, the 100th anniversary now of this war, that we wanted to commemorate in whole of Western Europe and especially in Belgium, because Belgium was, of course, the battlefield of that great war. And what struck me was that although thousands of Africans and Asians fought during that war side by side with the Allies, with the French, with the British, we did not see this fact in the commemoration. We did not see the fact that we talk about the Senegalese, the Algerians, the Moroccans who fought by the thousands side by side with the French against the Germans. So, and the thing is also that this period in history, the First World War, is a very good documented period. You know, there are so many books, fiction, non-fiction, movies that have been made from this about this period, and yet there are so many that talk about the contribution of the men of color, the black man, during this war, and the same goes for the Second World War, where you have also the same system where the colonies, France, for instance, used people from the colonies to go fight the war in Europe, but also elsewhere, also in Asia, also in Africa, and we do not talk about it. So I thought that is something very weird to to do, you know, to ignore a bit this part of the history. So what I wanted to do is to reconstruct this history, to write these men back into history. Of course, I chose one character, this Amazigh young man, which I don't give a name to even. He's nameless. So only one man who we will follow during his journey from Morocco to the north of France. But I thought it is important to give him a voice, to give him a face, and to let him be a kind of, how to say it, a witness of this period, so that we can write, that he can write his story back into this narrative, this collective memory. I think that was for me very, very important.
Već na početku knjige vi ste naveli, citirali jedan akt, zakon o regrutiranju domorodačke vojske. Francuzi su dakle imali pravo tražiti pomoć od svojih kolonijalnih podanika, ali su smatrali da su na području svojih kolonija donijeli napredak, mir, oslobodili ih epidemija. Smatrali su da imaju pravo zapravo pozvati na dužnost te momke i to su i napravili i naš zapravo glavni lik je našao se na europskom tlu. Međutim, jednom i osobnom odlukom, kada je saznao da je po identitetu zapravo napola Francuz, od bijesa što sad ima novi problem, jedan unutrašnji konflikt, tog svog oca pokušava napast, ubiti, toliko je ljutnje u njemu. Kao kazna je završetak u zatvoru i on sad može birati da li da istrune u zatvoru ili da ode boriti se za Francusku u Prvom svjetskom ratu. On se ipak na čuđenje tog svoga oca našao kao vojnik u ime Maroka, pod francuskom zastavom se borio u Prvom svjetskom ratu i tu je u njemu veliki taj unutrašnji zapravo sukob. Kako ste tog mladića gradili?
Yeah, it's interesting that you start with this fragment from I think it's a law, French law, at the beginning of the 20th century, where they try to motivate why they are employing men of color in this European world war, and it's interesting to see how for every injustice there is, you can have a logic argumentation. You know, it sounds very logic and very reasonable when you hear what they say. Well, we went to the colonies and we brought prosper and safety and civilization, so we are entitled to use those men to fight the war, our war, and it's totally logic to employ these men. So I think I found it also very witty, very smart how you can justify this kind of injustice. You know, it is in the beginning an injustice to colonize. You know, you don't do that. You don't go somewhere, a country where people live, and then say, oh, this is interesting, this is mine, let's take it. And then you take it and then you try to motivate, to find arguments why you have the right to take something. Because you bring civilization. And then you use the resources. And you use not only the resource in the ground, but also the men and the people. And then you say, well, we're entitled because we came here and we brought civilization, so you have to give something in return. So it's quite witty, you know, this argumentation, but you see it during history also. And when we talk about, for instance, the slavery, that was, of course, something much unjust. You know, going somewhere and treating people like property, like objects that you can sell, that you can... You do that by argumenting in a witty way. You say, well, actually, these are not real people. Because if they were real people, we could not sell them. We could not trade them. We don't do that with people. But because of the fact they are black, that means that they are not fully people like we are people. So we are entitled to enslave them, for instance. So you find that kind of argumentation during history, and it's quite shocking, but very witty, you know? And this young man, he discovers, of course, that his father is a Frenchman, and that creates, obviously, a kind of identity crisis, because, you know, everyone wants to belong somewhere, you know, belong and have people who love you and who you can call father or mother. And in his case, of course, it's a bit difficult because his father is the colonizer. That is, of course, something that he is in conflict with. And he, in a rage, of course, attacks his father, he beats him up, and then as a punishment he has to go to jail. And he gets this choice. Either he stays in this jail and he will go crazy or die, or he could go fight for France during 1 year or 2 years. That is the choice that they give him. And it's, while I was doing research for this book, I found out that a lot of men who have been recruited in those armies did it on so-called voluntary basis, because they had they were paid also to go fight. But also a lot of people were in the situation of this young young man who were in a prison, and they in order to get to be absolved of the punishment, they had the choice to go and serve in the army during a year, and a lot of young people did that. So and that was the case also for this young man to go and fight, and then we'll see after a year if he's still alive. He could be a free man, of course. But there is something double also about this young man, because he is also very curious, you know, to know more about the country of his father, to know more, to be closer, and because even if the fact that he is very mad at his father, and that he's shocked that his father treated his mother the way he treated her, he is still a child, you know. He's still he wants to be someone's son. And I think that is a bit the condition of humans, you know, that you want to belong, that you want to be surrounded by people who love you. And I think that is something very common to people, and that is also what drove him to go to France.
U trenutku kada dolaze brodom iz francusku luku,
on osjeća stanoviti ponos. I tu je ta podvojenost od mržnje do ponosa, od znatiželje do odbojnosti, tako da mladić želi upoznati drugi dio svog identiteta. Priču koju mi je ispričala majka da ga zapravo zaštiti od zlih jezika, od težine sredine u kojoj su živjeli. Kazala mu je da je njegov otac bio pripadnik jednog hrabrog plemena ratničkog Zajen. Međutim, kada saznaje da nije to baš tako, naprosto u njemu se rađaju novi svjetovi. U zadnjem dijelu romana jako je dramatično i upečatljivo opisano ratište. Prvi svjetski rat bio je težak rat rovova, velikih fizičkih kasapljenja, i jako ste to onako slikovito taj užas rata opisali. I iz Afrike zajedno ratuju mladići iz Senegala, Alžira, Tunisa, Maroka, iako su naspram Francuza oni zapravo potčinjeni, oni su ti drugi, i među njima samima se događa događaju konflikti, događa se ta nekakva refleksivna drugost.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see how they reacted upon each other, because of course it's only in the army that they get to be together, you know, and to see how how to react to one another. And mainly what is interesting is that in the French army, and I did some research also on that, is that there was discrimination, obviously, towards soldiers of color, comparing to white soldiers, to French soldiers, but there was also a more discrimination towards the darker your skin was, the more discrimination there was. So compared, for instance, to Senegalese soldiers, the Arab lighter skinned Moroccans and Algerians were treated better than the black soldiers. So that was these distinctions, you know, and it is also something that was seen by the Moroccans, that these distinctions, this distinction between white, colored, black, has been applied in the army, and it made my character, for instance, think about identity, you know. It is only when confronted with others that do not look like you, and when confronted with the fact that you are not treated equally and that you are not seen the same way as white soldiers, that you begin to think about what your own identity, about what makes the difference between you and me, for instance. What makes that I'm treated this way and the other one is treated the other way. So it's only there where that this character, this young man, starts to think about his identity. You know, before he was living in Morocco in a small village, and identity was not really an issue. But confronted with others who treat him differently and who give him an example to how to treat others who do not look like him, he starts to think about identity. And I think what is important also is that he is a young man who thinks that his little village is like the rest of the world, and he discovers that it's not the fact. You know, it's the world is not his little village. The world is much more complex, and it's a kind of a coming of age of that young man, that he discovers that life and the world is much more complexer than he ever thought.
Na bojištu, na ratištu, mladić piše dnevnik, bilježnicu, i to ga dosta skupo košta. Nakon što jedan korumpirani francuski časnik strada tijekom napada, mladić zapisuje da taj časnik zaslužuje smrt. I sam je svjestan da je možda to prenaglašeno, da ta rečenica ne stoji, da nekako ne rezonira, da nije njegova istina, međutim u tom trenutku mu se čini da je to baš tako. Kasnije zbog iste te rečenice biva osuđen na smrt. Tako da pisanje dnevnika koštalo ga je ponovno povratka u zatvor, ponovno suđenje, dakle pisanje priče, njegove priče, njemu je donijelo novu nevolju.
That is to say that writing is not something for the fainted heart. I think that writing is, in some situation, can be very dangerous, you know. Interesting is that this young man discovers the joy of writing also, you know, because he is writing a diary to keep up with what is going on in their lives and to keep a trace. But soon he discovers that there is something else that is playing an important role during these writing sessions. That is his imagination. You know, his imagination becomes very vivid, and he describes situations that are not really happen the way that he described them. So his imagination is going, has a life of its own, and he enjoys that because it gives him also power to how to say, to mold reality, to create his own reality in words, and that's something that he really enjoys doing. And then at a certain moment, there is this incident with this officer who has been killed after an attack, where he or his friends had nothing to do with it, and yet he described this incident as if they had a hand in the death of the officer, that finally they took action, and it is because of them that this officer died, and this is good because this officer is a horrible person, so they were not passive anymore, they did something, now he's dead. And he wrote that in the diary, but in reality, all of this did not happen. This man just died after an attack from the enemy, the Germans, and so on. And when he wrote that, and it gave him a good feeling because it gave him an agency. You know, he was no longer following, he was master of his, how to say it, fate, and that gave him a good feeling. But afterwards, when he reread what he wrote, he thought it's a bit exaggerated. I have to put this sentence away. This is not how it happened, and he erases the sentence. But of course, you can still read the sentence because he puts crayon over it, but you can still read the sentence. So, just to say that, and it's this trick of his imagination that will play an important role in his fate, because when they when the officers read the diary and discovered this sentence, they think, all right, he complotted against the officer to kill him, and that costed him his life. So, and he tries to explain to them also that it's a thing of his imagination, you know. How can something, it's like writing a novel, you know, it's fiction. And he explains to them that is what he has been doing. And of course, nobody believes him.
Ako dolazimo I do naslova romana, Reci to nekome, na kraju tu svoju priču, taj svoj dnevnik, tu svoju bilježnicu, mladić, znajući da ide u smrt, želi ostaviti nekome, želi ostaviti svojoj obitelji, svojoj sestri i tog svog oca kojeg odjednom iznenada dobija u život, kojeg I voli I mrzi, zadužuje zapravo da njegovu priču prenese dalje. I kaže, ipak sam pronašao riječi da opišem naš život kako ne bismo bili posve zaboravljeni I izgubljeni. Zbog toga želim da moja sestra dobije ovu bilježnicu kako bi znala što se s nama dogodilo. Zašto je važno ispričati priču?
Oh, it's important for so many reasons, of course, to tell stories and not to forget, because they're important. The stories are important, you know. Why is it important to describe what happened during the First World War? It's important because for our collective memory, it's important for us to know where our ancient parents, grandparents came from, what they have been living, to learn from the past, also to know where you came from. So it's important to tell those stories, every story, not only the story told by those who dominate the narrative, you know, those who have the power to take the scene and to talk and to tell the story, but also to tell the story of those who have not the power and the scene to talk about their experience. And it's important because every story matters. You know, I think the title of the festival, you know, every story matters because from every perspective we can learn something. You know, if you only have one-sided stories told by one dominant group, and it's interesting, but it's not complete, you know. If you open up to stories told from different perspectives, you will get a more layered story, more nuance. You get to know the complexity of reality. I think that is very important. And also, it's also part of our history, you know, to not forget every contribution, every man and women who had an experience that is worthwhile telling. So I think that mainly is why those stories are so important, you know. Perhaps they do not, how to say it, they are not that different from stories told by, I don't know, French soldiers, or the stories that has been written by, for instance, one of our big writers in Belgium, Stefan Hertmans, or Erwin Mortier, or Jeroen Oorlieslagers, who all wrote about the war. And this story adds another perspective, and I think that is important.
Evo, hvala. Možda bi se vratila na dio vašeg istraživanja građe romana. Dali ste puno informacija o životu u marokanskom selu na početku 20. stoljeća. Kako su došli ti podaci, na koji način ste istraživali? Posebno mi je bilo zanimljivo kada ste opisivali lik majke ovog mladića. Ona je kao mlada, trudna žena, neudana, bila protjerana iz svog sela. Dakle, nije mogla sa djetetom ostati u nekakvom okruženju pristojnih obitelji. Je li to stvarno tako bilo i na koji način ste došli do tih svih podataka? Ovaj ženski dio me baš zanima jako.
Yeah, well, I think it's not a surprise that women who were at that time unmarried and pregnant, they were not really well seen, you know. We have it not so long ago also in Europe, where unmarried women, I think in Ireland, they had this policy where unmarried women were put into a kind of a big home where they had to stay, and then the child was born, and then the child would be put for adoption or something, and then the woman could return to her family, because it was a disgrace in a Catholic country to be unmarried and to be pregnant. So I think that is something that you will find all over the world. It's patriarchy, you know. We dominate women that way by controlling their bodies and controlling what the good way is to have children and what the bad way is to have children. So, and that is something that is a phenomenon all over the world. And of course it is a phenomenon in Morocco at the beginning of the 20th century, but unfortunately we see it also till today, you know, that women who are pregnant and that are unmarried, that is still a stigma in Morocco. It's changing now a bit, but very slowly, and those women are very fragile in Moroccan society. So I think that is a thing that interested me also. The research that I conducted was reading a lot of historical texts and books that describe also the Sultanate of Morocco during the 19th century, the 20th century, mainly written by European scholars. And that was the easy part, I think, because you could find quite a lot of information about that, because at that time, of course, the region was of interest in Europe because of the colonization, so there was a lot of information about those regions. But what was, I think, very difficult for me to find was the information about the men of color during the First World War. There was not so many information about that. You could find a lot of information about the World War, because I told you already, this is a period that has been well documented, but specifically it was very hard to find information about this topic about men of color from Africa, from Asia, who were in the army. And surprisingly, you would think, surely there must be some French or Belgian academic who investigated this, but I didn't find him. What I find, it was a Dutch academic who wrote a book about men of color during the First World War, and some Canadian academic works about this issue, and that helped me to see how these young men were treated, where they get their training before going to the battlefield, and so on and so further. So also some texts I read in French law propositions and French debates that took place in the French Parliament, for instance, discussing whether, as a token of gratitude to these young men, French should not give these men, for instance, the French nationality. And then you read a vivid conversation in Parliament between the politicians saying those who wanted that, it's a minority, and those who didn't want that, and a majority who said, no, we cannot do that. We cannot give them the French nationality because that's too big a gift for them. Even if they come and fight here and die here, we cannot do that.
Ima jedan moment gdje otac našeg mladića, glavnog karaktera, pokušava spasiti
svog sina iz zatvora i obilazi urede administracije pokušavajući od njega napraviti francuskog državljanina, međutim nailazi na zatvorena vrata. Nije to samo tako postati Francuz, to je odgovor administracije.
Because this French nationality is almost sacred, you know, you cannot just give it away to people who are considered not really civilized or not European, so that was quite a difficult thing to do. And you see this also in the father who is not the best person in the world, but still he doubts also whether having a child with a Moroccan woman makes him a lesser of a human. That is something that really is playing in his head. And still he goes and makes an effort to save his child, because it is his child.
Strana njegove ličnosti. Evo, idemo polako prema kraju. Možda još samo jedan moment, prvi susret oca i sina. Otac zapravo misli da je to nekakav nepismeni mladić koji ne zna čitati. Međutim, ovaj mladić vrlo rano pokazao interes za znanje. Dakle, ta njegova znatiželja ga je svugdje vodila, tako je od svoje majke otišao već u svojoj nekoj 12. godini sa jednim šejkom i naučio je pisati, proučavao je uglavnom vjersku literaturu, međutim, toga je nekako, osim što ga je opismenilo, osim što mu je otvorilo svijet literature i jezika, nekako je razvilo njegovo biće čak i u duhovnom smislu. I kad mladić piše o tom svom iskustvu, kao da imamo tekst u tekstu. Možda to su meni, recimo, stilski najljepše napisani dijelovi romana. Možete malo komentirati to.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was fascinating. So I was thinking, because it's, of course, a young man who is illiterate, and he starts to learn the alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, and he starts to read and write, and then next step is to read texts and to understand the first meaning of the text, and then, of course, he has been pushed by his teachers to go further and to seek the deeper meaning of a text, because it's symbolic, it has a deeper layer, and he's really motivated by his teacher to really grab the text and to dig deep in it and to find this spiritual and this deeper meaning, and he struggles with it, because he had a trouble learning the alphabet, learning to read and write, and now it's not enough. He has to read on another level, and it's quite fascinating to try to describe this process. How does someone who is illiterate and learns to write and read discovers this deeper world of literature, of text, of meaning, and although he struggles, I think, in my opinion, reaches nevertheless this point where the text opens up to him, and where he gets into the text, and where he gets into, and it's as if he tumbles into a completely different world where nothing is as it seems. You know, what he has thought that reality is not reality anymore. It's as if the colors become much brighter in his mind. So that is what I was trying to describe. I think it's a fascinating thing to. Yeah, I think I said something somewhere in the text that he wanted to stay in this magical spiritual world, and that he didn't want to be cast away from it, because if he would be cast away from it, he would fall down on the earth, and there is only him and the earth and nothing else, and that is something that he doesn't want to experience. He wants to hold on to that, kind of spiritual experience.
Duhovno iskustvo.
Nakon tog iskustva ga je onako sudbina dobro prodrmala, od odlaska u rat do povratka u zatvor, do pričanja priče i ostavljanja nasljeđa proživljenog iskustva i te bilježnice njegove sestri i obitelji. Ja mislim da smo uspjeli nekako glavne neke okosnice ovog romana reći. Jesmo li nešto zaboravili ili da ostavimo nešto i čitateljima da sami istraže kroz čitanje? Vjerujem da ste mnogi već i pročitali roman. Ako niste, možete ga povoljno kupiti svih ovih dana festivala. Rachida će vam rado i potpisati. Moramo li još nešto reći o romanu ili da nešto ostavimo i tajnovitim?
Yeah, I think we should leave it a bit of mystery. So if you want to know more about it, just read the book. It's in Croatian.
Imamo i na hrvatskom prvu knjigu Rachida Lamrabet. Ono što je važno reći da je ova knjiga dobila je dvije književne nagrade. Jedna veoma cijenjena nagrada je Flamanska kulturna nagrada za književnost 2019. Dakle, zaista sad na hrvatskom jeziku, evo zahvaljujući prevoditeljici Romane Perečinec i nakladničkoj kući Ljevak, imamo pred sobom jedno važno djelo europske literature, jednu važnu temu. Ja bih vam se zahvalila na dolasku, na pažnji i Rachida, puno hvala. Jako ste lijepo predstavili ovaj roman. Pljesak, molim vas.